strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge. Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.
Damn, that shit was dope.
Welcome back to another Warrior Creed live stream with me, the Radical, Maajid Nawaz, with you as always, bringing this week's analysis on geopolitical events, especially in foreign affairs, but also domestic UK affairs. And as you can see today, the subject is the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and its chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, seeking arrest warrants against Netanyahu, as well as some senior Hamas figures. That's the title for the live stream today. ICC seeks arrest warrant for Netanyahu as Iranian president and foreign minister are also killed. Of course, that happened at the same time. So we'll be addressing both topics because, of course, they are also on the international arena, highly likely to be related to each other. And that's the graphic we're using for the show today. You'll see that in the Rumble live stream landing page as well. But as always, this will all be available, the receipts and all the links via Radical Media. And that's at majidnawaz.substack.com. But let's begin with the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi's confirmed death. He was in a helicopter near a border region. I believe it was near the border of Azerbaijan with Iran. And his helicopter came down. There you can see the Times headline, dated the 20th of May, 2024. Iran President Ibrahim Raisi confirmed dead. And just to read from the extract from that article, the Times states, Ibrahim Raisi, the Iranian president, has been killed along with his foreign minister after a helicopter crash on Sunday. State media confirmed that there were no survivors in the accident, which took place as the president was returning from a visit to neighboring Azerbaijan. The Times continues, Ibrahim Raisi was seen as a protege of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and a possible successor to the cleric, the supreme leader, who wields ultimate power in the Islamic Republic. When Raisi won elections in 2021, he brought the presidency back under the control of hardliners after reformist Hassan Rouhani's 8-year term. Raisi, who was sanctioned by the US for his role in executing political prisoners in 1988, remember, as much as we're going to talk about what's going on here in the geostrategic chessboard, let's remember this man was no saint. It's important to keep that in mind as well. I'm going to carry on from the Times. Raisi, who was sanctioned by the US for his role in executing political prisoners in 1988, was widely reviled by the regime's critics. He helped oversee a crackdown on mass protests in 2022 that erupted after a young woman died in police custody after she was arrested for not wearing a proper hijab. The death of the Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, means elections, which were due to take place next year, will now be called within 50 days. So Iran is set to now have elections within 50 days to replace their president, who effectively is in charge of the domestic affairs, though not national security. That comes under the supreme leader and his Revolutionary Guard. But still, Iran will be expected to hold elections within the next 50 days to replace Raisi. Of course, the foreign minister will also be replaced. Now, commentators such as the state-affiliated Alexander Dugin of Russia, a geopolitical analyst and philosopher, widely regarded as being closely tied to the Kremlin in his analysis and therefore probably a highly reliable source for the Russian perspective on these subjects. Dugin states on his profile, "We cannot affirm yet that for sure, but there are too many coincidences. The end of the legal term of Zelensky on the 2nd of May 2024 makes him, brackets, in the eyes of the Russians, close brackets, a legitimate goal as a head of illegal bunch of terrorists. On the eve of this possible decision, the global West started a priori intimidate, I think it means intimidating Russians, organized the killing of anti-Ukrainian Slovak Prime Minister Fico, and succeeded in alleged, quote, natural catastrophe that took a life of Iranian President Raisi and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran. These acts, beyond their regional reasons, in brackets, decisive EU elections, Middle East conflict, convey the message, don't touch Zelensky. But it is possible that against all evidences, these events are just coincidences for those who believe in them. So Dugin clearly tying the death of the Iranian President Raisi and his foreign minister to the wider global hybrid war that we here on Radical Media have stated many times we are experiencing, and that is that World War III is a hybrid war, hot and cold, domestic and foreign, between populations as opposed to between states, though it involves states, of course. But the real war, or World War III, that we find ourselves in is actually a war for our allegiance, for our souls, for our consciousness. And that's something we repeated at the end of January in 2022 on the Joe Rogan episode, JRE 1780. That's the number of the episode. And you can review that for yourselves if you want to understand a bit more what we mean by the nature of this global hybrid war. But that's what we find ourselves in. And Dugin, here in his post, is connecting everything that's just happened in Iran with that wider global hybrid war. And that may well be the case, because as you can see here, the Business Post has reported that Russia and Iran were working to create a single currency for the BRICS affiliated nations. That's the Russia-China alliance with Iran and other non-aligned countries, South Africa and others, in a alliance that is being used to counteract the Western alliance. And now they're even seeking their own single currency. So it may well be that the death of the Iranian president and his foreign minister are connected to these wider events. It's probably the case. And of course, in that vein, it's no coincidence that the US and its own warhawks, such as Victoria Nuland, who you can see here now on your screen, have been nudging us closer and closer to a open conflict with Russia in this World War III. So, as you can see on the screen, Victoria Nuland, it says, is back demanding that the US openly facilitate strikes by Ukraine on targets inside Russia, something the Biden administration had previously insisted would never happen. A once unfathomable escalation, which now barely raises an eyebrow. That's by Michael Tracy on his feed on Twitter. And Beverly Turner, a British GB news presenter, says the US administration are literally nudging us willingly towards World War III. Why? Well, we have some insights as to why, and we've published those reasons prior on Radical Media. But before we remind everybody of those insights, here is Victoria Nuland pretty much escalating the Russian-Ukrainian conflict to a head-on war between the US and Russia, which would be an apocalyptic Armageddon. Let's have a look. Hopefully she won't get her way, but let's have a look to what she said.
These Russian attacks that are coming from bases inside Russia. So I think there's also a question of whether we, the United States and our allies, ought to give them more help in hitting Russian bases, which heretofore we've not been willing to do. I think if the attacks are coming directly from over the line in Russia, that those bases ought to be fair game, whether they are where missiles are being launched from or where they are where troops are being supplied from. I think it's time for that because Russia has obviously escalated this war, including, as you said at the beginning, attacking Russia's second city, Kharkiv, which is not on the front lines, and trying to decimate it without ever having to put a boot on the ground. So I think it is time to give the Ukrainians more help hitting these bases inside Russia.
One of the reasons that the administration has hesitated is because they believe it will escalate things even further with Russia pull the U.S. further in. Why not? Why do you think that's a good idea?
because it's Russia that has escalated this war. Russia has learned how to pull its forces back out of the range where we have allowed Ukraine to use our weapons and get our support. So they are getting a direct advantage in this war from our hesitation, and they have escalated massively. As you know, they have flattened a third of Kharkiv without ever having to get on the ground there. So it is time to stop that and help Ukraine push them back.
Now, aside from the Freudian slip there by Nuland, who is very clearly globalist cabal, and just look into the history of what she's done in Ukraine to understand that, her testimony in Congress, where she stated very clearly that there were US biological weapons lined up all against the border with Russia inside Ukraine, the geopolitical equivalent of which is, by analogy, if China had biological laboratories lined up at the border inside Mexico facing the United States. I mean, you thought the Cuban Missile Crisis was bad. That would provide ample reason for the US administration to invade Mexico, and they probably most likely would do so immediately. Well, that's what Nuland herself admitted to doing to Russia with biological weapons, US biological weapons laboratories based in Ukraine on the Russia's border. She is a war hawk through and through, and radical media has addressed all that before. But if you notice her Freudian slip there, she said Russia's second city of Kharkiv. What she meant to say, of course, was Ukraine's second city of Kharkiv, but she said Russia's. That's around the mark of around 48 marks. And I think that's probably because she understands what she's done in Ukraine and is unable to, a bit like when Bush tried to condemn the Ukraine war, if you remember, and he accidentally said, when a country illegally invades Iraq. I mean, these things, you can't fully purge them from your guilty conscience. But nevertheless, that was Nuland there, unhinged, telling us that she wants the US to directly strike Russia, inside Russia, to facilitate Ukrainian strikes directly inside Russia, which would open up a US-Russian front directly in this hybrid war, which is an absolute absurdity, and only a mad person would consider doing such a thing. And thankfully, we don't think that's going to happen, despite her protestations. Though the reasons why these escalations, both inside Iran with the death of the president and Nuland and the Ukraine situation, the reason why these escalations keep on rising is because there is one party in this hybrid war, one alliance in this hybrid war, one side to it, that right now has nothing to lose from provoking World War III. As we forecast in this radical dispatch, dated the 17th of April, 2024, Israeli invasion of Rafah looms. Well, that's obviously happened now, but Israel stands isolated after Iran's retaliation. That dispatch contains the following words, which help understand why these provocations keep occurring against Iran and Russia. And we're just going to read this extract for you to help understand it. It says, think of this like a game of chess. The better player is able to wear down their opponent until there is no point in them fighting any longer. A bad player will act recklessly and trigger World War III, because in chess terms, triggering World War III can only ever bring about a stalemate, not a checkmate. The only reason one will want to play for a stalemate is if the alternative means to lose completely. This helps to explain why Iran was showing restraint while Netanyahu was provoking war while not making it inevitable by bombing the Iranian consulate in Syria. Of course, this was written before he went into Rafah. The principle stands, whether it was the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Syria, a subject over which it appears that the person Global's LBC replaced me with on my show on LBC was herself dismissed unceremoniously by Global's LBC because she raised the issue of Netanyahu attacking the Syrian consulate inside Iran. Nevertheless, that was written then, and it still applies today, whether it's the attack on the consulate or now with the downing of the helicopter carrying the president and the foreign minister, or Nuland's provocations vis-a-vis Ukraine into Russia. One party is quite obviously seeking to escalate conflict. And that's because they're playing for stalemate, because they realize that by provoking World War III, that's the only result you can get, stalemate. And the only reason a person plays for stalemate is if they know that the alternative is to lose completely. That's where we are. And how does somebody lose completely? Well, you can see it happening already. Keep in mind something we've been saying, which we constantly remind viewers and listeners of, from the 27th of October 2023. It's up here on your screens. We said it then. On the night the campaign, Netanyahu's retaliation began back in October 2023, Netanyahu is about to overplay his hand tonight. And just how he's overplayed it has become apparent from yesterday, because the ICC prosecutor has now publicly declared that he seeks the arrest of Netanyahu and of Hamas leaders. And we're going to read a bit from that BBC article there. That was the BBC we were showing you there. You can see ICC headlined, ICC prosecutor seeks arrest of Israeli and Hamas leaders. And an extract from the article states the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, has applied for the arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, for war crimes. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh, along with the group's military chief Mohammed Daif, are also wanted for arrest. He said Israel's prime minister and defense minister were suspected of crimes including starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, murder, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, and extermination. Neither Israel nor Qatar are members of the ICC, but the Palestinian territories were admitted as a member state in 2015. In the event of warrants being issued, the ICC would rely on member countries to carry out an arrest. No Western-style democracy has had an ICC arrest warrant issued for its leader before. Should Mr. Netanyahu become the first, it will deeply alarm Israel and its allies, as well as testing the powers of limitations of the ICC. So that's clearly the response for those attempting to curtail warmongers and warhawks on the globalist side. And that is, of course, Nuland, Netanyahu, the likes of Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, and Tony Blair on the UK side. These are all the globalist warhawks who have a history of constantly provoking wars. Their time, by the way, is nearly up. You can take that from us here at Radical Media, because that's something which is to us quite evident. But at the end of the day, the response to the globalists' attempts to escalate this conflict globally, this hybrid World War III, and to provoke it to a situation where states are directly confronting other states in a hot war, as well as the hybrid nature of it, which is already happening, by the way, but to escalate it so that states are directly, Russia is directly fighting America in a head-to-head hot war. That ambition that they have to escalate this war isn't being met. Instead, the other side to this, the BRICS side, are seeking legal means for address via this ICC arrest warrant request, as you can see. So that's where we are. But Netanyahu, of course, has responded to this. Before we show Netanyahu's response, let's play for you Mr. Karim Khan of the ICC, its chief prosecutor, telling us exactly why he is seeking the arrest of Netanyahu, as well, of course, of Hamas, as we mentioned.
Applications for warrants of arrest before pre-trial chamber 1 of the International Criminal Court in the situation in the state of Palestine. I can also confirm today that I have reasonable grounds to believe, on the basis of evidence collected and examined by my office, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant bear criminal responsibility for the following international crimes committed on the territory of the State of Palestine from at least the 8th of October 2023. The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity of extermination and or murder, persecution, and allegations of crimes of committing other inhumane acts. On the basis of evidence collected and examined and analyzed by my office, I have reasonable grounds to believe that 3 senior leaders of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Daif, and Ismail Haniyeh bear criminal responsibility. These three Hamas leaders are criminally responsible for the killing of Israeli civilians in attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other armed groups on the 7th of October 2023.
So there it is. It's very clear. He, as far as he's concerned, is stating that the law, in his view, has been broken by both the Israeli side and the Hamas side, and he wants all of them to be held criminally responsible. So fair enough demand for somebody who's a prosecutor, though Netanyahu has reacted as expected. This is Netanyahu's reaction. The outrageous decision by the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan to seek arrest warrants against the democratically elected leaders of Israel is a moral outrage of historic proportions. It will cast an everlasting mark of shame on the international court. And Netanyahu has form here. He's decided that the ICC seeking arrest for suspected war crimes against Netanyahu is somehow anti-Semitic. Yeah, have a listen.
ICC prosecutor Karim Khan to seek arrest warrants against the democratically elected leaders of Israel is a moral outrage of historic proportions. It will cast an everlasting mark of shame on the international court. Israel is waging a just war against Hamas, a genocidal terrorist organization that perpetrated the worst attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Hamas massacred 1,200 Jews, raped Jewish women, burned Jewish babies, took hundreds hostage. Now, in the face of these horrors, Mr. Khan creates a twisted and false moral equivalence between the leaders of Israel and the henchmen of Hamas. This is like creating a moral equivalence after September 11th between President Bush and Osama bin Laden, or during World War II between FDR and Hitler. What a travesty of justice, what a disgrace. The prosecutor's absurd charges against me and Israel's defense minister are merely an attempt to deny Israel the basic right of self-defense. And I assure you of one thing, this attempt will utterly fail. 80 years ago, the Jewish people were totally defenseless against our enemies. Those days are over. Now the Jewish people have a state, and we have an army to defend our state. Notwithstanding the blood libels Mr. Khan has leveled, Israel will continue to wage this war in full compliance with international law. We will continue to take unprecedented measures to get innocent civilians out of harm's way and to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in need in Gaza. Mr. Khan also sets a dangerous precedent that undermines every democracy's right to defend itself against terror organizations and aggressors. The ICC has no jurisdiction over Israel, and Mr. Khan's actions will not stop us from waging our just war against Hamas. But Mr. Khan's abuse of this authority will turn the ICC into nothing more than a farce. He's doing something else. He is callously pouring gasoline on the fires of anti-Semitism that are raging across the world. Through this incendiary decision, Mr. Khan takes his place among the great anti-Semites in modern times. He now stands alongside those infamous German judges who donned their robes and upheld laws that denied the Jewish people their most basic rights and enabled the Nazis to perpetrate the worst crime in history. 2 weeks ago, on Holocaust Memorial Day, I pledged this: no amount of pressure and no decision in any international forum will prevent Israel from defending itself against those who seek our destruction. To all the enemies of Israel, including their collaborators in The Hague, I renew that pledge today. Israel will wage our war against Hamas until that war is won, because never again is now.
So there you have it. The chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, is deemed anti-Semitic for wanting to seek arrest warrants against Netanyahu for what are quite clearly war crimes committed in this conflict. But Netanyahu seems to believe that, A, because he's been elected, though indirectly, of course, it's a proportionate system in Israel, so there's a coalition government, but though he's been elected, he believes that that's why he shouldn't be held responsible for war crimes. In addition, because he's Jewish, he doesn't think he should be held responsible for war crimes. it's a very strange one to consider that a chief public prosecutor whose job it is to look into issues of war crimes should be deemed anti-Semitic for believing that there is reasonable grounds for seeking arrest for against somebody that appears to have committed war crimes. And if you see in that video, Netanyahu, of course, justifies once again, as is always the case, that his war is just because he is facing a brutal terrorist organization that he compares alternately in some cases to the Nazis, and other days he compares it to ISIS. Both analogies are woefully inaccurate, though, of course, Hamas does engage in targeting and has engaged many times in targeting Israeli civilians in acts of terrorism. And that's something which we believe we've done more to tackle here in our past capacities than most other actors when it comes to counter-extremism on the planet. But nevertheless, Netanyahu has justified his just war as somehow being justifiable because he's targeting Hamas. But let's remember something. It was that same Netanyahu who deliberately funded and propped up Hamas all these years. And you can see here from our post, did Netanyahu fund and deliberately prop up Hamas to undermine the Palestinian state? Well, we've now got a video for you, as we've been saying anyway here on Radical Media. But now former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert is saying the same thing. He says, in answer to that question, one word, he says, yes. And then, of course, he continues to explain. Have a look at this.
Netanyahu deliberately propped up Hamas in Gaza all these years, funneling cash from Qatar to Hamas as a way of undermining and dividing the Palestinians and cynically preventing a two-state solution from emerging?
Yes. You are repeating what I've been saying for a long time, long before the October 7th. From day one, Netanyahu downgraded the Palestinian Authority and almost inevitably upgraded the Hamas. The fact is that Netanyahu, as I say time and again, many years before October 7th, he released more than 1,000 Hamas murderers. On top of them, Yahya Sinwar, who turned out to become afterwards the leader of Hamas and the commander of the Prophet's operation, which was committed on the 7th of October. So there is no doubt about the priorities that Netanyahu had for all these years. To say that Netanyahu ever dreamed that one day Yahya Sinwar, instead of cooperating with him as he probably planned or hoped, will do what he did on the 7th of October, that's too much. But I certainly hold him responsible for the fact that the Palestinian Authority was downgraded, that there were intentionally in purpose, no serious negotiations, not a genuine effort by the Israeli government to embark on meaningful negotiations for a two-state solution. It's absolutely what I have been saying all these years.
So that there was former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert saying that Netanyahu did indeed prop up and facilitate Hamas via Israel, of course, co-founding Hamas. That's a matter of record, but also funding them all these years in order to do what? In order to undermine the secular Palestinian Authority so that the face of the Palestinian representation could be a Islamist, and in this case, a jihadist terrorist group, so that the international community would find it impossible to champion a Palestinian state as represented by jihadist terrorists, which would have been easier if the Palestinians were represented by the Palestinian Authority, which is a secular authority. The idea that Netanyahu had in propping up Hamas, therefore, was to make a Palestinian state impossible. You heard that from the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert himself, though all the receipts, and I know many of you would want receipts for these quite strong and damning allegations, they're all to be found in Radical Media in this article, which, if you remember, from October, you can see the date there. I believe that says October the 15th, 2023. Headlined, Netanyahu funded and supported Hamas for war. receipts. It's all in there. Go back to Radical Media and look at that for yourselves. It's maajidnawaz.substack.com, and it provides all the evidence for this idea that Netanyahu did indeed fund and prop up Hamas all these years, including, by the way, his own words caught on a hot mic saying as much, so that he could divide the Palestinians and make creating a Palestinian state impossible. It was a classic divide and conquer tactic, but once divided, the conquering was done by propping up the more extreme elements so that nobody could support them. And that's how the Palestinian people found themselves permanently conquered by Israel. It's a sly move, but clearly what appears to have been done. So you saw in Netanyahu's response to the ICC and Karim Khan saying, you can't come after me. I'm going after these terrorists who are worse than Nazis and worse than ISIS. Well, even on the assumption that his analogies are correct, how is it that everybody else suddenly becomes a terrorist apologist for not fully supporting Netanyahu in his maniacal ethnic cleansing in Gaza, but he doesn't become a terrorist apologist for helping to fund and prop up those very same terrorists that he's saying we're terrorist apologists for not supporting him to kill? Think about it. These are the same people, Hamas, that Netanyahu was happy to help fund and Israel was happy to co-found when it suited them. And when you oppose the war in Gaza and ask for it to stop, you're the terrorist apologist, not the people that helped to found that group and helped to fund them, Israel and Netanyahu. So what they're hoping for is that nobody realizes all these contradictions, but it's our job here in Radical Media to make sure you have all the receipts, because this is indeed the Achilles heel of Netanyahu's defense. So again, if you go to Radical Media, maajidnawaz.substack.com, and go to this article from October the 15th, Netanyahu funded and supported Hamas for war receipts, you will see all the receipts for that point. And the message, we believe, is beginning to get through. Here is a post by the British Independent Member of Parliament, Andrew Bridgen, put out yesterday, and it states the following: supporting Israel's right to defend itself, brackets as the majority of the British public do, does not have to mean supporting unchecked aggression against Palestinian civilians in Gaza, brackets as the majority of the British people do not. I asked Armed Forces Minister Leo Doherty at Defence Questions today how the government is navigating this conundrum. Are you convinced by his answer? So that's Andrew Bridgen, MP, and have a look at the video of him asking, and you can see exactly what the British government's response was.
Question 8, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the UK and Israel have a long-standing defence relationship, as we discussed already this morning. Israel is a partner in the region, and an agreement for UK-Israel defence cooperation was signed in December 2020.
Andrew Bridgen.
I thank the Minister for that answer. But, Mr. Speaker, the problem of unconditional UK military support for Israel is that, while quite rightly there's a majority of this House and a majority of the British public who support our intervention to help protect Israel from missile attacks from third countries, when it comes to Israel's intervention and aggression in Gaza, it's a different story. How will Her Majesty's government's policy aim to sort out this conundrum?
Well, Mr. Speaker, nothing is unconditional, but we are, as I've already made the point this morning, is that we are supporting our ally overcome a devastating terrorist attack. And we do that because that's the honourable thing to do. Simultaneously, we make the point to our ally that the protection of civilian lives must be at the top of the operational agenda. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, we use our military capability to ensure that as much humanitarian aid can flow into Gaza as quickly as possible.
Mark Logan. Thank you.
It's a bit of a wet answer, but you can see the fact that Andrew Bridgen is beginning to raise these questions in Parliament, the same Andrew Bridgen who's been raising Midazolam questions in Parliament, the same Andrew Bridgen who blew up the post office scandal, which is now quite accepted that he had a point in and is all over our national headlines, the same Andrew Bridgen that has repeatedly raised questions concerning COVID mandates. We put it to you, the fact that Andrew Bridgen is the one raising these questions about what it means to precisely to have promised unconditional support to Israel is a significant shift happening right now in Parliament, because people that have been watching developments among politicians, and people in particular who've been watching Andrew Bridgen, will understand he tends to be ahead of the curve on some of these controversial topics. we suggest to you, of course, radical media is ahead of the curve and always has been. But for a politician, though he's somewhat behind how far ahead of the curve we believe ourselves to be, but for a politician, he's well ahead of the trends in Westminster. So that's something that's worth watching. And in terms of trends, of course, the public is even further ahead of this, and you can see that as represented by all the protests that are ongoing against Netanyahu's ethnic cleansing of Gaza. But here you can see a human rights lawyer, Juan Tayyib Ali, who's a partner at Bymans & Co., which is a very well-known UK law firm, and he's put out a very candid warning. It's called Warning to UK Members of Parliament, and it states, "We warned you that Israel was committing war crimes. We put you on notice that if you were complicit, we would seek to prosecute you. It is probably too late for most British MPs, as the ink of history on your potential complicity is almost dry, and you already made your decision whether or not to support war crimes. We warned you that the ICC issuing arrest warrants for war crimes was real. So is complicity in those war crimes. It is time for each individual MP to make their position perfectly clear. If you remain complicit in war crimes by providing political cover or material support, we will work to hold you personally accountable in accordance with the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court and the International Criminal Act right here in the UK. We pledge to make MPs accountable in court for their actions. Accountability has begun. We will add to it this week. Justice is coming." And that's Tayyib Ali, who is a partner at the well-renowned human rights law firm based in London, Bymans. It's quite stark, a warning to MPs that they are being watched and that they will be held accountable for complicity in war crimes. And by way of example, we'd like to show you what sort of hypocrisy is involved here, because this isn't the first time the ICC has sought arrest warrants after world leaders. If you recall, back last year, the very same ICC, with the very same chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, actually issued an arrest warrant, didn't merely seek one, as they've said they're going to do with Netanyahu, seeking an arrest warrant, which the judges at the ICC will have to approve or disapprove, but actually issued an arrest warrant against none other than President Putin himself. And compare the reactions between that arrest warrant against the ICC arrest warrant against Putin with the one now that they're seeking against Netanyahu and Hamas. And we'll show you both UK and US reactions. Here's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak commenting. You can see there in February 2023, commenting on the ICC's decision to issue an arrest warrant against Putin. The Independent newspaper reports in the headline, "Sunak hopeful over formal charges at ICC against Russian officials shortly." So he was quite happy there, wasn't he, with the whole thing? And of course, likewise with Biden. You can see here in March 2023, the BBC reports, Putin arrest warrant. Biden welcomes ICC's war crime charges. So both the UK and the US were welcoming of the ICC issuing arrest warrants against Putin. And then yet, all of a sudden, what happens when the same ICC merely seeks arrest warrants against Israel's PM Netanyahu, among others? Well, that same Prime Minister Rishi Sunak of the UK says, as according to London's Evening Standard, Rishi Sunak, the headline reads, slams deeply unhelpful ICC bid to arrest Israeli PM Benjamin Netanyahu. Subheading, UK says Israel's being held to a double standard and won't say if it would execute any arrest warrant. What on earth? And it gets worse. Here's Biden in The Guardian. Headline, Biden attacks request by ICC prosecutor for Netanyahu arrest warrant. Subheading, US president sides with Israeli PM as he calls Karim Khan's pursuit of warrants for Netanyahu along with Hamas leaders outrageous. I thought we were meant to be supporting the international rules-based order. And I thought the whole point of a double standard is one rule for thee and one rule for me. So how can you accuse the ICC of a double standard when they've issued arrest warrants for people on both sides of this World War III hybrid war that we're in? And you're the one only accepting one side, the Putin arrest warrant, praising it, saying you hope the Russians are arrested, and yet you reject the Netanyahu arrest warrant. Who's got the double standards? Mr. Sunak? Who's got the double standards, Biden? Clearly not Karim Khan of the ICC, who's merely seeking to apply the law as he sees it. But nevertheless, perhaps inadvertently without realizing it, Nigel Farage has pointed to what's going on here in response to a tweet by one Genevieve Hall-Allen that states exclusive. Lord Hague, that's the British politician William Hague. Lord Hague has said that he and Sir Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister, are like two old guys on a park bench, setting the world to rights. As he revealed, the pair have put aside their political differences. And Nigel Farage has stated they're globalists together. And it's that we believe, whether Nigel realized it or not when he said globalists together, that's what we believe is going on here. Globalists together, on the one hand, praising the ICC request for arrest of Putin while condemning it for Netanyahu. Praising, as you can see, even Biden, the ICC's war crimes charges against Putin, condemning it for Netanyahu. Globalists sticking together. And yet, we, despite all of that, still believe that Netanyahu's time is come, as we state here in this post. Q card, Netanyahu's time is come. By his own deeds, he can no longer be part of our shared future. And that's something we firmly believe is the case, and we said it from last October. You can see how it's escalating now. It is pretty much the case that we, as we stated, Netanyahu overplayed his hand, and his chance at recovering from this intact as Prime Minister of Israel are increasingly disappearing. Netanyahu overplayed his hand, and how that could potentially play out in the UK. Well, something to keep in mind is that just as Iran has announced elections in 50 days, it's, as Apple Martini on Twitter has stated, amazing how many elections are taking place in 2024, just as Iran has stated that they're holding elections. Let's not forget elections. Perhaps that was a Freudian slip. Let's not forget that the US and UK are also holding elections this year. The UK and probably maybe even before the US, but both of those countries, as well as Iran, all holding elections this year. And what that means is that there will be a change of government in those countries. And what's it looking like for the UK? Most likely to be the Labour Party, with all of our concerns that entails and all of our critiques of the globalist agenda that they will seek to usher in. One thing they've already announced is this. And have a look. If we can get it up, there we are. Headline in the Telegraph: Labour backs ICC efforts to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes. Subheading: Shadow Foreign Secretary urges government to recognise jurisdiction of international court. 20th of May 2024 in the British Telegraph. And it pretty much means the writing's on the wall for Netanyahu. If the Labour Party, of course, they may not stick to their promise, but either way, it's going to be politically very difficult for Netanyahu to recover from this. But even if the Labour Party doesn't stick to their promise, merely announcing they intend to hold Netanyahu accountable if the ICC does issue arrest warrants, makes it quite difficult for him to then visit the UK and for the then Labour government not to do anything about the pledge they've just made that they seek to implement ICC decisions. Of course, the alternative is to completely undermine the international rules-based order and ignore international law. But if you do that, you can't then claim that you're fighting to uphold international law. If the very objection you have to terrorism is that terrorists violate international law by targeting civilians, well, you can't then say international law isn't worth the paper it's written on once it's applied to you. So they are in this, as Andrew Bridgen describes, conundrum. And this conundrum isn't going away anytime soon. As you can see here from the Telegraph once more, Labour backs ICC efforts to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes. And that's it, folks. It's looking like Netanyahu's time is come. He will probably see this war to a conclusion, whatever a conclusion means for the Israeli war cabinet. But then elections will happen. Those elections will sweep away the old guard. And in the US, Trump will come to power. In the UK, as we say, may well be a hung parliament, but let's see what happens. But whatever happens, it's looking like there's going to be drastic change after 2024. And the way the world's been running, and the impunity with which Israel has behaved and is behaving is probably set to come to an end. As painful as it has been to get to that point, and remains painful to get to that point, that is the end goal and the point that you should all remain focused on. And that is that Netanyahu in particular, Israel in general, will not continue to enjoy this level of impunity beyond this year, impunity for their actions. That's all we've got time for today on Warrior Creed. Don't forget, this live stream stays up for free on Rumble, and our premium subscribers on Radical Media get the podcast version of this live stream as part of the Warrior Creed podcast on Radical Media. And to subscribe to that, as well as the free written version of this live stream with all the receipts provided in the Radical Dispatch via Radical Media, go to maajidnawaz.substack.com, and you can get both the free written version as well as listen to the premium podcast. Until next week, as usual, at 10 a.m. UK time, 3 p.m. UK time, 10 a.m. US time, you've been listening to the Radical Maajid Nawaz, and this is Warrior Creed. Thank you once again for tuning in.
The strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge. Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.